where he concentrates on analysis of the uses, the roles and types of thought experiments in Kant's work, both in his transcendental philosophy, his philosophy of science, and, as we will hear today, and its applicability to questions of education. Okay, so Sergio, are you available? Can you turn off on your mic and start your talk?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect. Shoot.
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation and for all of you for being here. So let me put this. Let me share my screen. So as the previous talk showed, it is a fact that research on Kant's perspective on education has a predominant moral focus. I would like, however, to devote this talk to the theoretical education. So in the previous stage of my research, which I outlined in the first Kantian Rationality Lab conference, I center my attention on the types, roles and types and roles of thought experiments in Kant's philosophy of science. I would like now to suggest that from a Kantian perspective, that particular form of reasoning, namely thought experimenting, could be applied as a tool for instructing students to, namely, think by themselves in the school and the university classroom, perhaps. But experimenting has proven to be an effective tool for teaching sciences, particularly in physics. And research in that direction has shown that they could be profitably used in, for example, triggering the interest of upper secondary level students in contemporary physics, transforming scientific knowledge into school or public knowledge, and the triggering tacit knowledge in the classroom. Also, thought experiments in physics has proven effective for exposing the students' preconceptions, so that the teacher can have a common background in order to work his theory. Simple thought, a simple but maybe profitable pedagogical use of thought experiments could be illustrated by this last item. John Clement has shown that thought experimenting can help to deal with the preconceptions on static normal forces of 112, I think, school students taking the first year physics courses, most of whom believed that a table does not exert any force on a book placed on it. The students were presented with an anchor case, putting a hand on a spring, and a series of intermediate bridging thought experiments that would lead to the target case, namely the book on the table case. So thought experimenting involved imagining the book on a foam pad, for example, or then on a less rigid surface, while comparing their relations and discussing this result by the lead of the teacher. The question I want to pose is if we can get the same benefits for using thought experiments with pedagogical purposes in classrooms composed of students with different backgrounds. Let us say, for example, humanitarian, particularly philosophical, and on the other hand, scientific profiles. With polydisciplinary classrooms, I just want to emphasize that the classrooms to which the inquiry is addressed involve students from different disciplines, but it does not necessarily imply that the outcome of the lessons must be any sort of combination of the fields. It could be well replaced by the standard adjective multidisciplinary. I am thinking particularly about common core curricula for humanities and the sciences. Subjects like epistemology, philosophy of science, maybe research methodology or pedagogy-related courses. The question then is if and how thought experiments can be profitable use in philosophy courses addressed to students with whether philosophical or scientific profiles. Answering this question requires first inquiring into the relationship between scientific and philosophical thought experiments and establishing a comprehensive conceptual framework. My thesis is that Kant's work offers not only that framework, but also a modest and not yet exhausted inventory of thought experiments that could be used in high school and university classrooms. To that end, I will start by outlining some aspects of Marco Busoni's pioneering neo-Kantian account on thought experiments that I consider relevant for the present discussion. Thought experiments without real ones are empty, and real experiments without thought experiments are blind. It has become the motto of Busoni's transcendental operative account. So he says that thought experiments are conditions of the possibility of the real ones. Because without the a priori capacity of the mind to reason counterfactually, we could not devise any hypothesis and we could not plan the corresponding real experiment. That is, we could not put a question to nature, which is precisely the Kant's conception of experimentality. On the other hand, without real experiments, we would not have reliable empirical laws on which new thought experiments can base their anticipated answer to the new questions. Besides, the account is operative. Like the account is operative because Busoni says both real and thought experiments are methodical procedures guided by certain hypotheses. And at the same time, however, such hypotheses aim to understand by applying the method of systematic variation how a given experimental apparatus varies in response to our specific operational interventions on it. So, for example, by systematically varying in the imagination the surfaces on which a book rests. In a further development of his account, Busoni has addressed the question of the relationship between scientific and philosophical thought experiments, and Kant's notion of an experiment of pure reason is considered to be an early anticipation of the later type, the philosophical type. In Busoni's words, an experiment of pure reason consists in showing that certain distinction, let's say the distinction between things and appearances, as appearances and things in themselves, is true because it's both a necessary and sufficient condition for avoiding a contradiction of pure reason with itself. This way, it's possible to identify some common characteristics between both forms of experimenting. Both inquire through modalities and counterfactual assumptions. And in both cases, in order to understand and test the truth value or the reliability of a thought experiment, we must adopt a genetic reconstructive attitude. We must retrace, reconstruct, reappropriate, and evaluate in the first person the steps that led to that conclusion being asserted, or in other words, the reason why it should be accepted, why we should accept this result. Their main difference, on the other hand, derives for Busoni from the very distinctive character of philosophy. What is distinct, he says, I quote, what is distinctive of philosophy is the fact that it reverses the direction or attitude adopted towards reality by the scientific inquiry. Instead of exploring some particular aspects of natural reality, the philosopher investigates the conditions of the possibility of the human faculty of knowing and morally evaluating what we call nature or natural reality. In a word, our relation to it. Now, the following are some desirable pedagogical consequences of what has been said so far. Both philosophical and science or scientific thought experiments generate a reappropriative attitude through the first person evaluation necessary for any students independently of on their academic profile. Both forms of thought experimenting are methodologically compatible, compatible, and both rely on analogical reasoning and the use of model and counterfactual assumptions. It follows then that the first two consequences, it follows from these first two consequences that thought experimenting necessarily implies thinking by oneself and constitutes a concrete means, specific means or tool for achieving this demand. It is possible to trace, third, it is possible to trace analogies also between both thought experiments. And the best example is Kant's experiment of pure reason, which is formulated in analogy with the chemical experiment of reduction. So exploring that possibility is a promising path for triggering the interest and bridging preconceptions of scientific and or technical profile students. So you can come to the scientific background knowledge, to the epistemological one, in principle, because this is precisely what Kant did. This is precisely Kant's analogy in the critique, the preface. And finally, the variety of available thought experiments facilitates finding middle ground cases for multidisciplinary classrooms, or just to suggest a didactic path. It could be we could organize asynchronous profile-oriented modules according to the needs of the classroom subgroups. So you can pick the academic profile of the students and asynchronous, just let them do their analysis, perhaps also individually. So about the last desirable consequence, we can, let me see, I'm lost in the slides, okay. The following cases from Kant's philosophy have been recognized as thought experiments, and I showed this just to point out that since the very concept of thought experiment was introduced in reflecting about Kant's work, but Kant never used it. He never reflected on the difference between thought experiments and real experiments. Then there are some labels like example, analogy, case, these words that are symptomatic of the early stages in the history of thought experiments in which the concept wasn't coined. So following these traces, it is possible to find thought experimental forms of reasoning which perhaps we have failed to recognize as such. Some examples that I have found in the literature and that I have reconstructed by myself as thought experiments are, for example, the following. In the second analogy, the example of the house, the example of the ship downstream. In the transcendental aesthetic, in Lisa Shebel's words, Kant offers a thought experiment that is meant to lend further support to the idea that the form of appearances can be investigated independently of their matter, and thus that the pursuit of a science of a priori possibility is legitimate. So it's basically a thought experiment that consists in abstracting from sensibility some elements in order to check if this project of transcendental aesthetic is viable or not. We have also the second paralogism, where Kant announces an experiment of pure reason. Well, I say of pure reason, he doesn't mention it, but there is this is clearly anchored to the procedure of experiment of pure reason about the usefulness of the proposition, I am a simple substance. So Kant describes this passage as an experiment. And he says, we will perform an experiment concerning the supposed usefulness of this proposition. I haven't gone deep in that direction, but I think that he actually means that this is an experiment of pure reason in the sense of a thought experiment. In the metaphysical foundations, we have the construction of the concept of rest as lack of motion, experiments on attraction and repulsion, on fluidity, on the relativity of space, with the case of the table that moves, a boat that moves on the table, and then the table on the cabin of a boat. Then the boat is placed in the river, and we judge the direction of the boat by looking at the bank of the river. So we come to this discussion about the relativity of space. And finally, the nebular hypothesis, which in the previous Kantian Rationality conference, I reconstructed as a thought experiment. Having addressed the if part of the question about the possibility of using thought experiment profitably in polydisciplinary classrooms, it now remains the question about how to assess them from a Kantian point of view. And I contend that the notion of use of reason is key for a comprehensive and truly Kantian approach to thought experiments. Yet, its importance hasn't been properly recognized in the current debates. Let's then reconsider Busoni's leading account on this matter. So, one of the main criticisms on Busoni's account comes from this author, Yiftach Feige, and he describes Busoni's project as follows. At the most fundamental epistemological level, thought experiments exemplifies what Busoni calls an inductive experimental use of reason. An inductive use of reason is experimental for Busoni in three respects. First, it employs the method of variation. That's the operational side. Second, it puts a question to nature and anticipates nature's answer. That is the transcendental role in devising hypotheses through modal and counterfactual reasoning. And third, it specifies a technical operations that are in principle testable by means of the real execution. So this is how Busoni's anchor his account to the principle of empiricism. So the notion of an inductive experimental use of reason, however, is not addressed by Kant, at least not directly. A Kantian account in the line of Busoni, therefore, requires explaining what the inductive and the experimental uses of reason consist of, by which means they are integrated, and how do they correspond to the letter of Kant's philosophy. I will argue instead that thought experimenting both in science and philosophy involve a variety of forms of the use of reason in a sense of that term that corresponds both to Kant's letter and spirit. For that purpose, I will present an outline of the main readings of Kant's first critique as a thought experiment. The starting point is Martin Kellin's 1972 paper on Kant's transcendental arguments, but he contends that thought experiments constitutes Kant's method for validating transcendental principles. Accordingly, transcendental arguments involve a non-inductive nor dogmatic type of argument that can be found at several places in the second analogy. And two passages of the critique are singled out that presumably contain such type of arguments. So Kalinin speaks in plural. Kant performs experiments of pure reason. Kant performs thought experiments in plural. And Pagan and Stewart, by their part, suggest that the Kantian type of thought experiment mentioned by Kalin is instantiated by the examples of the house and the ship downstream mentioned by Kant in the second analogy. There, a contrast is made between the apprehension of an appearance with a determinate order in its sequence by imagining a boat upstream followed by its perception downstream. And on the other side, the apprehension of the manifold of intuition when the series of perceptions have no determinate order, like by imagining a house from the rooftop to the ground or in any other direction. The aforementioned examples are not targeted at the passages singled out by Kalin as instances of the Kantian type of thought experiment, although there certainly is an implicit reference that abides. What is more, in his reading of Kant, Kalin takes the instances of the house and example as an example of apprehension of the manifold of intuition not constituting objective events. Thus, despite implicit reference to the imagined attempts of apprehending the house and the ship, for examples, these are for Kalin and for Kant just an illustrative moment, a part of a broader thought experiment that is the critique of pure reason as a whole, complete thought experiment. In a more recent approach, Busoni generalizes Kalin's reading by saying that the whole book can be seen as an experiment of pure reason, a philosophical thought experiment whose truth is guaranteed by the fact that human understanding loses itself in antinomies when it ventures beyond the limits of possible experience and attempts to deal with things in themselves. Let us, however, take further the approach to the critique as an experiment favored by Busoni. Kant not only establishes what an experiment of pure reason is, but he also offers criteria for the correction of such experiment. So he says, when an unavoidable conflict of reason with itself arises with a single standpoint, then the experiment decides for the correctness of that direction. That is, an experiment of pure reason operates by unveiling a conflict of reason and following the lead of Busoni, such conflict could be understood as the loss of the understanding in antinomies, and it is worth adding also in paralogisms and the idea of pure reason. Likewise, Wire and Wood's account on the genesis of the antinomy of pure reason sheds further light on Kant's notion of what is a conflict of reason. How can we understand it? According to them, during 1776 and 1777, there is, for the first time, what looks like a sketch for a whole intended critique. And then Kant suggests how antinomies arise. So according to Wire and Woods, we get one set of principles from the empirical use of reason, where the concepts of reason are applied to space and time as conditions of appearance, and a different set from the pure use of reason on the right, where space and time are not taken to be conditions of the use of the concept of reason. On this basis, Kant describes a set of competing principles that clearly led directly to the antinomy of pure reason expounded in the critique. So the first pair of principle, this is Wires and Wood, introduction to the critique. The first pair of principles from each group stakes out the debate separate into the first two antinomies in the critique. The disputes over whether or not space and time are infinite in extension and over whether or not they are infinitely divisible. The second pair corresponds to the third antinomy, which debates whether all events have an antecedent cause or whether there is a first cause that has no antecedent cause of its own. And the third part parallels the later fourth antinomy, which debates whether the whole series of events in the world is contingent or has an external ground that makes it necessary. And consequently, the critique would follow a method adopted by analogy with the sciences, consisting in the systematic performance of experiment of pure reason, that is, the illustration, a conflict of reason with itself, or what is the same, a conflict between forms of the use of reason and their corresponding competing principles. From this point of view, from Kant's epistemology, it is possible to address a case like the one that is exposed in the second analogy. It is possible perhaps to set up some elements, some analytical tools in order to assess philosophical thought experiments. And after all, one would expect from a Kantian account of thought experiments to embrace at least Kant's own examples. So we follow this logic, then we can describe the second analogy as a Kantian or transcendental type of thought experiment that displays a speculative, philosophical, pure transcendental use of reason aimed at the validation of transcendental principles and playing a key role for critical philosophy. It's speculative, it's a display of the speculative use of reason or theoretical, in contrast to the practical one. The theoretical use of reason, according to Kant, is that through which I cognize a priori as necessary that something is. It would be a display of the philosophical or discursive use of reason in which knowledge from pure concepts or just concepts, if you don't take the material reading of the a priori, knowledge from concepts, we get knowledge from concepts and not from the construction of those concepts like in mathematics. The same example, the same case of the second analogy would be a display of the pure use of reason, where space and time are not taken to be condition of the use of the concept of reason. And finally, it will be a transcendental. So Kant says that the transcendental use of reason pertains to the speculative use or the theoretical use when the latter is considered narrowly. So on this basis, we get some kind of analytical decomposition of thought experiments in terms on their intervening uses of reason that could be used to assess perhaps philosophical thought experiments. Well, I think by students in the field of philosophy, or just to better understand Kant's own thought experiment. Well, this is pretty much what I have to say. Thank you very much. And be glad to hear the questions.
Yes. Hands up. Who wants to give it a first shot? If not, then I will start. And it picks upon a topic that we had discussed actually before. And I'm coming back to this distinction that I found in Kant's work between sensus communis and sensus privatus that plays a role here. So the point of thought experiments is to engage in counterfactual thinking and to use modalities. So if we want to figure out what's possible, impossible, or necessary by means of thought experiments. And then with respect to a certain question, we just do not come up with commonly shared insights. What would Kant say then? I mean, obviously he could say, well, the person who doesn't reach the same conclusion lacks in common sense, or is prey to his or her own logical private sense or obstinacy. But that seems to be like a dogmatic answer, isn't it? Here's why. We could imagine that people use thought experiments in order to make up the wildest conspiracy theories, for instance. Yeah.
So basically, if I understand, is the question about some rules for regulating thought experimenting that are not strictly theoretical. Mm-hmm. If I understand the question right.
I think that my question cuts across the division between theoretical thought experiments and practical thought experiments, such as the galley example that Kate was replying earlier to. That's also, what would you do if you were such a person confronted with the threat of going to the galley if he does not confess that he has committed adultery with Anne Boleyn? That's also engaging in counterfactual situations and asking us what to do, practical necessity in this case, right? So I think that my question cuts across the divide between the theoretical and the practical. What do we do if engaging in a thought experiment does not lead to a commonly accepted insight? You know, nowadays people discuss a lot whether it is guaranteed that philosophical thought experiments lead to commonly shared intuitions, basic intuitions about modalities. Yeah. So is there any specific Kantian answer?
Of course, when we take the question to the practical realm, I think it becomes a way more complex, but precisely in the first part of my talk, this example coming from physics showed precisely, well, first of all, I don't think it's possible to defend non-fallible Kantian account of thought experiments. So we are not speaking, I think, I haven't seen any Kantian account of thought experiments which didn't embrace the functional reading of the a priori. So we don't have a set of finite principles of categories of the understanding from which we can derive our counterfactual reasoning or any other model of whichever form of reasoning we are relying with. So I think it's not possible to defend a non-fallible in the practical realm an account of thought experience that wouldn't lead us to take wrong decision, for example. But precisely the example that I picked offers a path of how can you get insights into or how can you correct something that is considered a misconception, because precisely those cases in which you act not according to let's say to law or you take a path of action that is not considered the standard one, then and analogically, or thinking about maybe perhaps simpler cases but related to the one in which you are, in which you find yourself, you could use reason to come to that common framework in which you are expected to think and to act. But if the question is that if by reason itself in any of its forms, in any of the form of its use, we can construct somehow a secure, like, infallible bridge to both to theoretical or to the theoretical field or the moral field. I think, I mean, I don't think that's doable. Or at least the conceptual analysis that I offered, I don't think that could lead to that path. I think correction of, let's don't call it misconceptions, perhaps alternative conceptions, it's possible, and it will be enhanced by the practice of thought experimenting, the correction of these.
Just to add upon this, in the case of physical thought experiments in the classroom, we can imagine that the teacher uses them only because they are sometimes more efficacious to bring the same result as a real experiment, which would be more costly and time consuming and so on, would cause that the teaching effect is the same, but it's it's more efficacious. However, and then the teacher could always say, like, it's secured that the outcome of my thought experiment is valid because I could, in theory, perform an actual experiment that would corroborate what I want to show to you, my students. However, in some cases, and for instance, the nebula hypothesis is such a case, I guess, the real experiments cannot be made.
Couldn't in that time.
What then?
Yeah, the economical dimension of thought experiments, whether you don't have the resources to perform it or simply the actual state of the technology doesn't allow to do it. But I think that independently of the absence of the means for performing the thought experiment, precisely, they are effective independently of these conditions. In the case of the nebular hypothesis, Kant states the corroboration of these goes to further generations. So he actually thinks that it is a must to corroborate what he's saying. But anyways, he develops a really intricate and really complex reconstruction of the movement of celestial bodies, starting for just nebula plus the basic forces of attraction and repulsion. And Kant is convinced that that these perhaps which use of reason is involved here. I think this regulative use of reason that is involved in order to understand the empirical knowledge as a whole, in order to integrate empirical knowledge. I think he's really convinced that independently on the fact of the probability or performability of thought experiments, there is a gain, there is something to get from it, and that his conclusions and his assertions doesn't really depend, or the validity of the things that they are saying doesn't really depend on performance. And this is precisely because the nebular hypothesis is not a performance of the empirical use of reason, but of the regulative use of reason. So if we apply Kant's insights in the critique and this notion of use of reason, we can understand that the rationality behind thought experiments allows us to perhaps to defend the validity of some arguments independently of these criteria of the performability, for example, in order to favor a different use of reason, which is also valuable by itself.
Okay, thank you. Peter Baumann.
Thank you. I might have missed something, and in that case, I apologize in advance. If not, then not. I'm interested in the extendability or non-extendability of thought experiments beyond factual discourse. I mean, you talked about physics and thought experiments about matters of facts more generally, but I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you also mentioned thought experiments about morality, about moral matters. And what would I do in that situation? Now, that example strikes me rather as a thought experiment in psychology. How would I react? What would be my disposition? So it would rather be a thought experiment pertaining to factual discourse rather than moral discourse. And Kant is really strict about the distinction between these. So I wonder what you think, what Kant would or should say about this extendability. I mean, there are reasons, I think, it seems to me, that for Kant to say no, there's no place for thought experiments in morality, and certainly also no place for thought experiments when it comes to aesthetics, right? What kind of thought experiments could we imagine there? But again, I might have been missing something, or I might have been taking something that you said as an aside, as an opportunity for me to go off on a tangent. But I found this interesting enough to ask you about this. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, this matter of the bridge between theoretical reason and practical reason, considering thought experimenting, it's certainly a really interesting question, because I think on the base of that question comes also the one about which use of reason is, let's say, stronger or less in a higher level. So typically practical reason and theoretical reason are placed at par. In some passages of the critique I have checked, but well, I haven't come to a clear insight in which well, to address your question in this way, about these here these what can we call it, these I don't know, perhaps scaffolding structure of uses of reason, and checking which if the practical use of reason has a central place compared to the practical one. And to be honest, you take me out of my depth, you take me to the moral plane, because that's respecting thought experiment. That's not a field that I have explored yet. I really want to come to that point, but I think there are some theoretical issues that there should be solved first. About the moral, taking thought experiments into the moral field, during the lectures we have that the Kantian Rationality lab has conducted. I think we have come to some discussions about if it's possible to instantiate, for example, moral principles without thought experimenting, without thought experiment in every man's reason. So in some sense, to instantiate the moral law, for example, a moral principle, you should counterfactually, modally, analogically anticipate the result of your actions. And I don't think it's possible to reconstruct that dimension of morality without at least hypothesizing that thought experiment thing plays a central role in instantiating these types of moral principles. So you basically, without this capacity, without this, without counterfactual reasoning, you wouldn't be able to, let's say, make any calculation about the result of your actions.
If I may just add a footnote here, that's very
Please.
interesting. And I'm reminded of the beautiful cases that here Kate mentioned, several cases, and one might wonder what the methodological role of these cases is. Are they just illustrations, right? Or are they cases to think about in a certain way and perhaps counterfactually? And that would support your last point. But I think this is also an interesting question. I don't know how much this has been explored in the literature, the methodological role of considering cases like the ones that are all over the place. And Kate mentioned some of the most impressive ones. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
David, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow on from this discussion and ask this. I'm starting to lose my grip on how to distinguish a thought experiment as a sort of genre of reasoning, because we're now talking in a way which would suggest that any sort of counterfactual thinking counts as engaging in thought experiments. So, and that seems to me to be, I mean, we can say that, of course, but it seems to me to be unhelpful, because it looked like we, you know, in your work, Sergio, you start with quite a clear conception of what it looks like we're starting out to try and delimit the contours of a thought experiment as a distinctive style of thinking. And now we're talking as if, you know, if we, after the conference, hang around on Zoom and say, it might have been better had we invited so-and-so. As soon as we start thinking about the respects in which that might be so, then we're engaging in a kind of thought experiment. And that would seem to sort of rob the concept of its sort of distinctive character.
Yeah, thank you, David. That's well, that's always a question about how can you make trivial thought experimenting. And precisely what we can extract from Kant's work is that, well, yeah, this capacity of reasoning counterfactually is what makes possible thought experimenting in the first place. So basically, if I say, what if it rains right now? What follows after my reasoning will be a thought experiment, a trivial one, and we can always reduce. We can always come to this point. But precisely speaking about the direction of inquiry, I will just simply say that there are, for example, Ernst Mach, in his work on thought experiments and knowledge and error, he considered tying knots as thought experimental form reasoning. He considered literature, Utopia, Plato's Republic, as a form of thought experimenting. But there are some philosophically relevant cases of thought experimenting in which your counterfactual or modal or analogical reason takes you to move the ground or some ground principles on which, in the case of the critique of pure reason, possible experience is anchored. And well, this is particularly clear, for example, in Kuhn's conception of thought experimenting, in which he says we don't learn only about the world by thought experiments, but about our concepts. And I think that in reflecting about the world, if we can also not only distract, but maybe illustrate or gain a better comprehension of our conceptual apparatus, then we come to a philosophical, maybe philosophically significant use of thought experimenting, which is the case that I'm considering, that I consider in my talk and that I'm researching actually.
Thank you.
I have a, maybe that's more a comment than a question, but you can react to it. So I read yesterday Samuel Fleischacker's book on Kant, on the Enlightenment. And it starts out with the standard historical narrative, according to which Enlightenment, among other things, was made possible by the rejection of traditional authorities and by the taking up of what science has to deliver into our worldview. And that the Enlightenment goals of thinking for oneself are particularly made possible by new scientific knowledge. Yeah? There's a traditional narrative about the Enlightenment. And it seems to me that your story could also be used in order to undermine a certain aspect of that narrative. Because if thought experiments are tools for thinking for oneself and thereby for promoting the Enlightenment, but also are necessary in order to perform, to produce good science, then it's science that profits from the Enlightenment attitude rather than the other way around. That's the first point. Of course, there's both, because you could also imagine that thought experiments are precisely being used in order to overcome conventional wisdom or conventional stereotypes about certain things, and that we engage in thought experiments in order to strengthen our skills. But then there is this other point which is relevant, is that Kant emphasizes in the quotation that I cited in the introduction, that it's not so much the understanding that is required in order to become more enlightened, but the effort of will and courage to speak up. Is there anything in scientific thought experiments that has to do with that kind of exercise of courage and will?
Courage and will.
You don't, I mean, this is a throwaway comment. You can or cannot react
well,
to
that's
as you please. It's things that cross my mind when I hear you.
Yeah, well, thanks. That's pretty interesting. I think I can't think right now about one of such cases, like an exhortation or an invitation of courage and will in thought experimenting, at least in the theoretical realm.
Yeah. But one could think of Galileo's courage against the Pope or the Church. Yeah, here I stand and I cannot do otherwise. Or actually, that's not what he said, but sticking to one's own beliefs that one has found out through scientific research that involved, in his case, thought experiments. Could be one example. Copernicus proposing a different solar system, so a different system for the motion of planets and the sun. Could be an example.
I mean, sure, there are many examples about these kind of consequences of thought experimenting, but I'm just thinking about if perhaps we can find textual evidence for systematical use and conscious and that's called conscious and systematical use of thought experiments for these purposes. And in the case of Galileo and that's called previous science, perhaps there were no more options. So, for example, Peter King's article on medieval thought experiments, that direction in which medieval science, the scientific paradigm of medieval science was thought experimenting, and so you don't do it in order to challenge, for example, authority. You do it because that was the scientific paradigm. So I'm thinking historically in which point, which would be after medieval, it's called medieval science, and in which point there was a philosopher or a scientist who, being conscious of and recognizing the historical charge of the concept of thought experiment, perform it with these proposals. That would be extremely interesting to find, by the way.
That would be very interesting, and that would actually be historical evidence against Fleischaker's standard narrative. That sort of like the Enlightenment thinkers just took up science as it was and used it to promote critical thinking, and replaced that standard narrative by a narrative that is more cyclical and more like there is a constant feedback between our powers of critical thinking and progress of science and society at large.
Yeah. Well, now perhaps now that you touch this topic, I remember when I first started studying this topic of thought experiment, I was actually reading Descartes, and I was struck by it. Struck me how Descartes described many of his reasoning as fabula. So it's like a tale. This is a tale. It doesn't have a real scientific heavy charge. So let's speak about science like we tell a story. And when I was reading that, I was thinking that that would be a clever strategy to somehow stating some scientific insights or scientific ideas without, let's say, taking all the political consequences, for example. Or when I read these passages in which Descartes describes what he's doing as a fabula, as a tale, I couldn't in those times just avoid thinking that this is precisely, let's call it a protection device or a form of having an influence on a realm different from the theoretical. It's called the political sphere. At the same time, staying in a safe place. I mean, it just came to my mind these ideas that I thought when I was first studying this topic